All right, ladies and gentlemen, this lesson is the English, the French, and the Spanish in the New World. We've already established the reasons and the technology that caused Europeans to sail across the Atlantic Ocean. We even went over the Columbian Exchange and we saw the exchange of goods and ideas and diseases between the Old and New World. Now we actually need to start setting up these maritime empires. We already saw the Portuguese trading post empire, but these empires, by the English, the French, and the Spanish, are going to be a bit different because they are actually going to take the land that is there in the New World and create colonies out of it. Let's go ahead and get started with our essential questions. What are the various reasons Europeans established maritime empires? And we've already gone over many of those reasons. Glory, God, and gold were some of the ones that we've already seen. And number two is what were the effects of these new interoceanic connections? We're really going to be focused on the effects because we're going to see all of these big changes that occur in the New World, changes that still have an impact on our life today. The proof of understanding is I can create universal questions for the Socratic seminar. I'll explain that more at what universal questions are and what the Socratic seminar is when we are in our synchronous learning session. Let's go ahead and start with the French. So let's start with the French colonies here. A couple big names that we should know: Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain. These two individuals were the main travelers and explorers for France. Now they're actually trying to find a northwest passage, a way to get from Europe and sail west in order to get through the Americas and over to China. That way they can trade. Now they're really unable to find that. I mean, technically there's one all the way up here, but they're not going to get through that. It's way too cold up here, and it's mainly ice. But we see that eventually they're going to settle here. Now they settle in this red area called New France. Now, what are they doing there? They are looking for beaver fur. During the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, the Swedes, the people from Sweden, fought with these beaver fur caps on their head. And because they were fighting against all of these other nations saw those beaver fur caps and said, hey, those are pretty cool. We should get those. So they started hunting beaver, especially in Scandinavia, which Sweden, Norway, and in Russia. And they hunted so many beavers that the beavers were pretty close to being extinct. And so they needed a new source of beaver fur. Well, what better place than in Canada, home of the beavers? So this beaver fur leads to the French coming to this part of the New World and actually working with the natives. So they didn't enslave the natives, they didn't fight against the natives, they worked with them. The natives were the ones who knew where the beavers were and knew how to hunt those beavers, and the French were more than willing to work with them if it meant that they were able to send beaver fur back to Europe and make a whole lot of money. Now, in addition to this, we know France is a majority Catholic nation and still is today. I mean, after all, it's home to Notre Dame, which is one of the or even the most famous Catholic church in the world. And so they're going to send missionaries to this area of the world. And this part of the reason why this area is so Catholic today, because these missionaries will set up many Catholic schools in this area and convert many of the natives to Catholicism. That is significantly different than the way the French treat their slaves in Haiti. So Haiti's all the way down here. It's actually right behind my little webcam here. But another French colony is Haiti. And Haiti, even though it's tiny, produces so much of France's wealth because of those sugar plantations. They will import African slaves and treat them very brutally in order to raise money and produce more sugar for people back in Europe. So we see the French treat the natives and African slaves a bit differently, and we'll want to keep that in mind. Let's jump to our English colonies. Now, our English colonies, our name that we want to know is John Cabot. He actually claims Newfoundland to Chesapeake Bay for the English, so we'll see that right here. In fact, while I'm here, what I do want to point out is the border between France, French colonies, and English colonies right here. So you'll need to keep this in mind because we're going to talk about this conflict in just a little bit. Now, the British are known for having the greatest navy in the history of the world, but it wasn't always like that. The Spanish were the ones who were actually known to have the best navy, that is before 1588. Now, there's a war, it's actually an undeclared war, we call it the Anglo-Spanish War. And what happened in the Anglo-Spanish War is that you had Queen Elizabeth in England. She's Protestant. And you have King Philip II of Spain. He's Catholic, King Philip II being the son of Charles V. Now, this war of religion against one another eventually leads to this battle of the Spanish Armada. The, Queen Elizabeth supports the Dutch, which is a Spanish property at the time. The Dutch are also Protestants, so they're fighting against the Catholic King of Spain. King Philip gets so upset, he says, I'm going to attack the English, so that way they stop supporting the Dutch, and so that way I can have all my possessions. And if we were in AP Euro, we would need to know all of that, but we are in AP World, so we just need to know that the English Navy is fighting against the Spanish Navy. Now, a couple things before we get into this battle, this big battle that takes place in 1588, is we need to know that gunpowder is still relatively new. We talked about gunpowder in Unit 3, but we know that the Europeans are the ones who are last to receive gunpowder. This entirely changes the type of naval warfare. Naval warfare prior to 1588 was mainly you would take your boat, ride it up next to your enemy's boat, and then you would board that boat and you would sword fight them and try to take their ship and take all the stuff that they have on it. The English have started to figure out that using cannons aboard a ship is significantly better at defeating your enemy than trying to board your enemy's ship. The second thing we want to keep in mind is that what we saw in Unit 3 was that Europe started to become more and more centralized. As these Europeans become more centralized, or as each country becomes more centralized, they gain more wealth and more power. Think Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. Because they have all this wealth and power, they can start to build bigger and bigger navies. So the Spanish Armada is this massive navy. We're talking they are going to send about 50,000 men in order to attack England. Now, they continue to attempt to get to England, but England's an island and it's very difficult to invade an island. Naval invasions are historically very, very difficult to pull off. And eventually, the Spanish Armada is forced to the city called Calais on the French coast, just to the south of England, so across the English Channel on the French side. And they dock all of their ships and they leave them there because they think they're done fighting for the day. Well, Sir Francis Drake, who is fighting for England, he's a naval commander, sees this and he knows that he's at a disadvantage because his navy is not as big as the Spanish Armada. So what he does is he pulls off one of the oldest tricks in the book. It's called a fire ship, which is pictured right here. He takes 8 little wooden boats and sets them on fire and just pushes them out into the English Channel and pushes them towards the Spanish Armada docked at Calais. The Spanish Armada sees this and starts to freak out. Now their ships are in a crescent formation when the fire ships are headed towards them. This crescent formation, if you don't know anything about naval warfare, is very, very strong. It's a good position to be in. Now, in order to prevent their ships from being burned, they cut off the ties, they cut the anchors, and they let the ships float out so that way they do not get hit by the fire. This breaks the formation and allows Sir Francis Drake to attack. Eventually, the Spanish Armada makes its way all around the British Isles in order to escape the British, but they get caught up in a current and the wind pushes them into Ireland where they hit the shore and they really can't get off. At this point, they're ambushed by the British and Irish military, and that is kind of the end of the day for the Spanish Armada. What we need to know about this is that the English, because they defeat the Spanish Armada, they are the ones who become the premier naval power. They're the ones who can control the seas. What we're going to see throughout the rest of this is that the English are the ones who are going to win in Europe, and so they win in the New World as well. And we'll see that more in just a little bit with the 7 Years' War. Now, yeah, the English colony, the first English colony, the first successful, quote unquote, successful English colony will be in Jamestown in 1607. And you'll see a lot more about this next year with Mr. Rattan in AP US history. It's in modern day Virginia. And when I say successful, I put it in quotes because most of the men, it's mostly men. There's actually no women aboard the first ship. Most of these men are coming to the New World in order to get rich and get rich very quickly. Remember, one of the major motivations was gold. The idea was that you go to New World, pick gold up off the ground, and go back. And so that's their mentality there. So when they get to the New World and they figure out that there's not gold on the ground, they just get lazy. They really don't build homes. They just kind of sit around and drink all the time because they don't want to do anything else. On Wikipedia, if you go on Wikipedia, I think this is funny. It says that they were not agriculturally inclined, which is putting it nicely. The people of Jamestown, the men of Jamestown, didn't want to actually do any work. They didn't want to farm because they just wanted to get rich very, very quickly. So 80% of them die within the first year. Now, if 80% of my students fail the AP World Exam, I would not consider myself a successful AP World History teacher, but apparently this is a successful English colony. You'll talk about that more when you get to AP US History. Now, one big difference between the English and the French is their form of coerced labor. When we say coerced labor, labor that is forced. It's not always slavery either. Coerced labor can be a little bit different. Like, for example, let's say you're a person in and you don't have a lot of money. You need to get a job in order to pay for food and pay for your home. And so you end up working at Walmart. You're in some ways coerced to work at Walmart. Technically, you could go anywhere else. You could get a different job, but because Walmart plays such a large role in the community, it's the only place that's really hiring. So in a way, you're forced to do so. It's not Walmart cracking the whip over your head and saying you must do this or we'll kill you, but in a way, society in your particular situation coerces you into doing that particular job. So there is slavery, and obviously you'll talk about that more in AP US history next year, especially in the southern colonies like Georgia, where slavery makes sense to have because of the cotton industry that is there. But we also get indentured servitude. Indentured servitude is like slavery, but it's a little bit different. With these indentured servants, what they're doing is they cannot pay to get to the New World, but they really want to get to the New World because there's nothing for them back in England. And so they board these ships. In return for having a free passage to the New World, they have to work, usually for about 7 or 8 years, in order to earn their freedom. So, in a way, yeah, it's not slavery, but they're doing the very similar work. You might say, well, this is completely different from slavery because in 7 years you were free. And you would be correct in saying that. But what I want you to realize, it's not like these indentured servants all of a sudden started their own businesses and then were able to, live these grand, wonderful lives. Most of these indentured servants, even after they were given their freedom, even after 7 or 8 years, were still so poor that there's no way that they could start their own business. And so they just ended up working on the same exact land that they had done when they were indentured servants. So this is examples of coerced labor, and we'll see more examples of coerced labor when we talk about the Spanish. Let's get to the French and Indian War here. If you remember this map right here, the French and the English are taking over this same land in the Ohio River Valley. Obviously, that is going to lead to conflict. So this war is known by many different names. It's the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War. And for those of you who are good at math, you figured, well, wait a second, how come there are 9 years up here? So the French and Indian War started in the colonies in 1754. And it's not until 1756 that the war is officially declared in Europe. So this is actually, in a weird way, the first world war because you have fighting in the New World and you have fighting in the Old World. Now, the fighting in the Old World is taking place between a variety of countries. You have France and Russia and Austria on one side versus Britain and Prussia. And we're not necessarily going to get into all the motivations behind that aspect of the war, behind that theater. We're just going to focus on the New World theater. So what we see is that this area is desired by the French and by the British. Here are the British, here are the French. They are fighting against one another. When I say French and Indian War, the French and the Indians, or really the Native Americans, are on the same side. The French often treated the Native Americans very well, as we talked about with the beaver fur trade. The English, on the other hand, did not. There were a series of wars, such as King Philip's Wars and the Pequot War, in which many of these societies, especially the Massachusetts Bay Colony up here, fought against the natives. So we can say, in general, the English and the natives fought against one another over land. So many Native Americans would have sided with the French. They fight over land in the New World, and in 1763, the war is finally over with the Peace of Paris, and Britain, as you see, ends up gaining all of this land here. What we need to get out of the French and Indian War is the fact that the British are the ones who are going to dominate North America, not the French, which is why all of this has more of a British background and a British culture from here on out. When you get to AP US history, Mr. Rattan will spend significantly more time on the French and Indian War in terms of how it impacted the United States over the long run. The Spanish are a little bit different here. So as we see, there's some Spanish colonies here. I mean, the Spanish colonies in Texas and in Florida, expanding all the way to the west and going all the way down to the tip of South America. But there's a few things that we need to know about the Spanish. The first one is the Treaty of Tordesillas. So in 1494, it becomes very obvious that all of these countries, all of the European countries, are going to go around and they're going to claim new land. That's going to lead to conflict. So we need to figure out a way to not have conflict. Pope Alexander VI divides the world into two, which is a almost racist way of looking at the world, to say that this half belongs to Spain, this half belongs to the Portuguese, and we're just going to ignore everyone who already lives there. But that's what happened with the Treaty of Tordesillas. Now, the Treaty of Tordesillas makes the line of demarcation. The line of demarcation just splits the world in two. Everything on this side belongs to the Spanish. Everything on this side over here belongs to the Portuguese. That's why the Portuguese are going to stay over here in the Indian Ocean Exchange, and that's why the Spanish stay over here in the New World in Mexico and South America. There are two notable exceptions we need to keep in mind. One is Brazil. You see, Brazil right here is in the Portuguese half, which is why Brazil is the only country in South America that speaks Portuguese instead of Spanish. The other notable one is actually all the way over here in the ocean over here is the Philippines. The Philippines are actually going to belong to the Spanish, and we'll see that a little bit later with Ferdinand Magellan. Now, there's two major conquistadors that we need to know. The first one is Hernan Cortez. So Hernan Cortez in the year 1519 will travel across the Atlantic Ocean to what is now the southern part of Mexico, pretty much the Yucatan Peninsula. Now, when he gets there, he happens to show up at the exact right time. This is one of the biggest coincidences in the history of the world. If he shows up 1 year early or 1 year late, he's dead on arrival, but he shows up in 1519. Here's why. The Aztecs are led by a man named Moctezuma II. Now, Moctezuma is a very religious, devout individual, and he believes that his god, Quetzalcoatl, is going to return. It just so happens that he's going to return in the year 1519. This god Quetzalcoatl will show up and he will be more than human. He will have lighter skin and he will have a beard as well. Well, when Cortez shows up, he shows up at the right time, 1519. He is more than human. Cortez is riding a horse. We have to remember from our study of the Columbian Exchange, natives had not seen a horse before. Horses were not indigenous to the New World. So Moctezuma sees this and he doesn't see a man on a horse. He sees one being, a man horse or horseman, whatever it is that you want to call it. He also sees that Hernan Cortez has lighter skin and he has a bit of a beard. So he matches the version of Quetzalcoatl almost to a T. And so Moctezuma decides not to kill him because he's unsure of exactly who this person is. It's a catastrophic mistake for Moctezuma II. Hernan Cortez will come in and he will wipe out the Aztecs. Yes, he has better weapons with his guns. Yes, he has better animals. He has the horses. But the biggest killer is going to be the diseases. And that's going to be the smallpox that's going to ravage through the native population because they do not have immunity to it, as we discussed in previous lessons. The other big conquistador is Francisco Pizarro, who will take over the Inca. Now, he'll only have 180 280 men, and he will bring down an army of 30,000 Incan soldiers. We're actually going to read more about that during our synchronous learning session, and I will let someone who is significantly more intelligent than I am, namely Jared Diamond, tell you that story and tell you the importance of it in terms for the entire history of the world. Let's talk about the coerced labor. And before we do, we have actually one more person that we should know, and that's Ferdinand Magellan. Now, he is a Portuguese man sailing for Spain. He will be the first person to officially circumnavigate the world, except not really, because he doesn't survive. So it's his journey that eventually gets the men, some of the men, all the way around the world. Now, you could go on YouTube and you can look up the video about him. It's actually his right-hand man, Elcano, and a fraction of the people that he started with who actually all make it all the way around the world. But we name it after Magellan because he was the leader of the expedition. What this does is that he attains the Philippine Islands. He obtains the Philippines for Spain. And that's going to be important for us to remember as we continue to talk about expansionism in later units. Just know that the Philippines belong to Spain, which is also the reason that many people from the Philippines are Catholic today, because the Spanish converted many of them. Now let's talk about the coerced labor system. If you think back to our study of the Inca, we talked about the mita system, in which every adult male had to pay a tax to the government of the Inca. This tax wasn't always necessarily in money, but was in labor. For example, many of these laborers had to build the roads that the Inca empire was most famous for. When the Spanish show up, they see this and they think, hey, this is a great system for us to take advantage of. And so what they do is they take the mita system and they evolve it and change it into the encomienda system, in which the natives, instead of working for the Incan government, work for the Spanish. Each Spanish individual, anyone who wants it, is given a group of natives, and the job of the Spanish is to teach the natives Catholicism and then also make them do a whole lot of work as well. Now, this will be ended in 1542, mainly because there's people like Bartolome de las Casas who speak out against this. So there are people within Spanish society, and Las Casas is a priest, so people are going to listen to him because priests are very highly regarded in the Catholic Spanish culture. And eventually, this encomienda system is going to be replaced by the repartimiento system, in which natives are no longer slaves, but they work for really low wages, which is similar to indentured servitude. So, if you're taking like a sky high look at this, if you're taking a bird's eye view, the differences aren't much. The Inca get slightly more money, but never really enough to move off the land and truly live a free life. This encomienda system is eventually replaced with the hacienda system, which is right here. The hacienda system is incredibly similar to the encomienda system. The only difference is that instead of being given a group of natives, the Spanish nobles are now given land, and they can use natives in order to farm that land and produce wheat, fruit, sugar, all of these other things that we've already talked about that natives and African slaves are being used to produce. At this point, it's very similar to indentured servitude. And you can start to compare it with what we've seen in the English colonies. But know that this system is spread throughout the entirety of the Spanish Empire. So when we're talking about the Hacienda system, we see it in Mexico and all of South America. We're also going to see the major changes to indigenous culture. The major one is the religion. So these Jesuit missionaries, if you remember the Council of Trent from our study of the Protestant Reformation in 1545, the Catholic Church needed to change its image. And so it sent out these Jesuit missionaries. The Jesuits were an educated group of Catholics who were meant to go convert people and do so in a more academic way. And so they attempt to do so. They attempt to convert these savages. If you remember from Unit 1, the Aztec and the Inca are using human sacrifice. So that's obviously going to scare the Catholics, Spanish Jesuit missionaries, and so they are going to attempt to convert these savages. As we could assume, these individuals in the Inca and Aztec Empire aren't going to fully adopt Catholicism, but are going to sync it up with their more traditional beliefs. And so we'll see examples of syncretism between these traditional local religions and Catholicism. That's going to be the end of the lecture there. So please make sure you have notes on all of those, and please make sure you bring your notes to class. That way you can use them in order to participate in our activities that we'll be doing during our synchronous session.